Do you think that people's perceptions about films dictate what they look for in a film? And I'll give you my example here. So my mom likes to watch action movies and Western movies as well, even though her favorite genre is definitely like Bollywood films, definitely old Bollywood films. And so I watched The Dark Knight with my mom, like the second movie in the Dark Knight trilogy, one of my favorite movies of all time. And I watched it in theaters. This is like back in I think 2008, and at the end of the movie, she's like, "What kind of movie was this? The hero dies, everyone dies. It's super sad. Like, what the heck?" And I'm like, "Mom, this is an awesome movie. What are you talking about?" But it's just that the disconnect in terms of like what you would look for in I guess, in a typical Bollywood film versus like maybe more, versus like what she saw there. And I thought that was very entertaining.
Hi everyone, this is Tom and welcome to the Cusp podcast. We're really excited about this week's episode as we've been working on it for quite some time now. And as you can probably tell from the earlier clip with Anka and his mom, this week's episode is an exploration of foreign films. Specifically, we talk about the types of stories that are told in different foreign film industries, the government's role in protecting and promoting their local film industries, and we also talk about foreign film adoption in North America. What you can learn from different foreign film cultures, what it's like growing up in the diaspora with foreign films as well. And specifically, I bring the Nollywood experience, which is Africa's largest film industry. Tony and Anka talk a bit about the Bollywood film industry, but the three of us realize that together we can't really cover all of the film industries around the world. So we're really excited to have a special guest join us this week. So could you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi everyone, my name is Nam. I come from South Korea. I came to US to study film in 2000. So this is my 20th year living in California. And I got my degree in film studies from USC. And then from 2008, I began teaching at Chapman University's Dodge College of Film and Media Arts. I teach different courses, but I teach Korean and Asian cinema. So Korean cinema is one of my areas of teaching and research.
So thank you to Dr. Nam for joining us in today's episode. Without a doubt, we don't cover everything yet. We're still missing the Latin American experience and the European film industries as well. But we're bringing to you Nollywood, Bollywood, Hollywood, and the Korean film industry. So we hope you enjoyed today's episode. Here we go.
Okay, guys, so lockdown's been happening and we've all been on Netflix binging stuff. But I wonder, what kind of movies have you guys been watching over this whole quarantine period? And have you been watching any like Bollywood films or Nepalese films for you, Anka? Because I certainly have
Um,
not watched a single Nigerian film in like 5 years. So, but I've been thinking about it now.
really?
Yeah.
You were thinking about it. You're thinking about diving in. Interesting. Yeah, I have. I like have. I guess especially the last couple of weeks, I've been watching a lot of Bollywood content. I've just like re-immersed myself in that world and just caught up on it. I think so. For me, growing up in a Nepalese household, like we watch certain Nepalese films, but I just don't think the film industry is as well developed as I would say the Bollywood film industry is, and so a lot of the film content that we consumed that wasn't Hollywood content was Bollywood content, and so growing up, I watched a lot of those kinds of movies. But I would say when I went off to university, I kind of took a break from all of it. And funny enough, sometimes when I felt homesick, I would watch like a movie that I watched as a kid to kind of rekindle that feeling of home that I had. And so that's kind of how it connected to me in terms of my childhood. And now when I watch Bollywood films, there's definitely a sense of nostalgia with older films that I've watched. And I'm a lot more comfortable with the genre now just because I've seen so many films.
So in like I
Yeah.
was asking in like the Indian peninsula, like India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal area, Is Bollywood the primary like media source? Is that what everyone watches? Like that's what dominates that area?
Yeah, I guess. Sorry, I'm just gonna answer your initial question. That I would imagine like Bollywood has become popular across kind of the South Asia area. Um, yeah, like Encore, like I think I still need to do the re-immersion that Encore's experienced because like you, Tom, I haven't seen Bollywood films. Like I've watched Bollywood films here and there, but I don't think I've been immersed in Bollywood as much as I was when I was a kid, when we were watching Bollywood all the time, in our family. I was interested in hearing kind of the medium because it's not like you could go watch a Bollywood film at like the Cineplex, right? I do remember one time, I think I was like 11 or 12. The Cineplex tried to reach out to like the South Asian people in Edmonton by putting in Bollywood films in some theaters. So my family and I went to go watch Doom 2. Uh,
Oh, that's a classic.
yeah,
By the
it's
way,
fire, man.
it's fire.
And for context, Tom, there are these movies, Doom 2, and it's kind of like the Fast and Furious of India. Is
Oh
how I
my god,
That's a great
I have
analogy.
seen Indian films that have visual effects, and they're funny to say the least. They're pretty funny.
I actually think the special effects aren't bad.
Not
Like,
not in Doom. Doom isn't bad. There are some movies where it's really bad. Doom isn't that bad.
Okay.
Doom is actually, I think, pretty good. Like, it's fun. I would just say it's fun, like Fast and Furious, right? And so we get into the theater, and it's like our family and one other South Asian family just watching watching Doom 2.
Is
And
that
I
the
was
whole
like, they're
market that
not
they
doing
wanted
this
to
again.
tap into?
Yeah. And I was like, they're not doing this again. And I think they underestimated a couple things. I think the biggest one was this culture in Edmonton, at least developed, where you know we weren't watching movies in the theater because they weren't available. So everyone would just get like bootlegged just DVDs or
Yeah,
CDs from like an Indian convenience store somewhere, right?
yeah.
And take them home. And so if you can buy a $3 bootleg, why are you gonna pay $7 to go to the movies? And like when you explain that math to an Indian dad, there's no
do
way
you
he's taking you to the Cineplex, right?
do you also think it's like a do you also think it's a cultural thing? Maybe not. Maybe this is wrong, but I find that like when you watch a film from back home, some part of the enjoyment is watching it with other people and then talking about the movie as it's going on and like screaming and arguing with each other, which is not
Yeah,
usually something you do in a cineplex, right?
you
Um,
don't. So there's two things I kind of want to say about this. One, Tony, I've had a very different experience when going to Bollywood movies here. Like I watched Simba, which is like a huge Bollywood movie, I think last year, 2019, and it was like a packed theater. People were like loving it, right? And I was like, okay, this has got a real. This was in Edmonton, right? So maybe that's just time passing and more people discovering theaters are showing this. And nowadays, when I go to a theater, there's always usually one or two Bollywood options, at least in like the Northeast when I grew up in Calgary or some places in Edmonton. But I will say, Tom, to your point, when I went to watch, it was in Nepal. It was in when I was visiting Nepal in 2007. I went to watch a movie back then. It was called Welcome, and Welcome is what we call like a masala flick. Like it's not necessarily very serious. It's just like a lot. It's a very comedic, fun kind of movie. And I went in there, and there was cheering, and there was whistling, and when there's like because movies have dances and songs. That's like a key part of it. Every movie is a musical of sorts. There was dancing to the music. People would get up and just dance, and it was just like a party. It was so distinct from the viewing experience here, which was kind of just like you stay in your seat, you laugh when you're supposed to laugh, and anything else besides that is considered like faux pas, right?
yeah, I think
See, and
yeah,
and again, there's a little bit of a different experience here too, because I think the culture almost flips. So I went to India in 2009 and watched the Three Idiots in cinema. Three
Three
Idiots,
Idiots is
Great
great
an
movie.
great movie.
amazing film. Amazing film. Even I've watched that, like so just amazing.
Yeah, and the audience was great. Like they were losing their minds. 3 years later, I go to India and I watch the Avengers. In theaters in 2012. you know, people were on their phones. Like there was this uncle in the front row, like on a phone call, like just in the middle of the movie. Like the camera was like off. Like the projector was like on only on half the screen, so they didn't even bother like setting it up right. And
Do you think? Sorry, go ahead. Finish.
no, go ahead.
Do you think that people's perceptions about films dictate what they look for in a film? And I'll give you my example here. So my mom likes to watch action movies and Western movies as well, even though her favorite genre is definitely like Bollywood films, definitely old Bollywood films. And so I watched The Dark Knight with my mom, like the second movie in the Dark Knight trilogy, one of my favorite movies of all time. And I watched it in theaters. This is like back in, I think, 2008. And at the end of the movie, she's like, "What kind of movie was this? The hero dies, everyone dies. It's super sad. Like, what the heck?" And I'm like, "Mom, this is an awesome movie. What are you talking about?" But it's just that the disconnect in terms of like what you would look for in a, I guess, in a typical Bollywood film versus like maybe more, versus like what she saw there. And I thought that was very entertaining.
I
Yeah,
think
and
being immersed in the culture that produced the film is really critical to catching all the social cues. So my dad watches
Mhm.
Star Wars and he hates Chewbacca. He's like, "What is this bear running around with the humans? You know, they just have a bear just running around." Like he calls him a bear. And so he just doesn't get the appeal of Chewbacca. But he watches Krish and he's like, he gets all of it, you know?
Yo, my dad has the same thing. So my dad will watch Harry Potter,
okay, what is
and then
Chris,
he'll look
though?
at
You have
us.
to give us some context. What is
Oh yeah, sorry. Krish is like a superhero movie.
But you know what's interesting though? Like in the world, there's only three official like woods, right? So there's Hollywood, there's Bollywood, and there's also Nollywood. Like Nigerian film actually has its own name, Nollywood, that is recognized globally because of just how much content we produce, right? And
Okay.
similar to like Bollywood's influence in like Southeast Asia, I would say Nigerian Nollywood's influence in Africa is probably just as large, right? So most people watch Nigerian
Really?
films for that same context,
Wow.
right? And it's interesting because we don't have like dancing or like music in our films. That's not necessarily the culture, but they're very like a lot of them always some of them lean into like the local languages primarily. A few of them are in English as well. Um, Over the years, they've changed to be more of them in English. But what I wanted to ask you guys is what do you think inspires or what do you think is usually the dominant narrative in Bollywood films? So, for example, in Hollywood right now, there's a lot of like superhero stuff or like indie coming to age kind of films. In Nollywood, I would say most of the films are like family matters or like, you know, a husband who may be unfaithful to his wife or people kind of, you know, leaving the village and going to the city. That kind of like grassroots family kind of narrative is primarily dominant in Nigerian films.
Mm.
What is the narrative in Bollywood?
So I would say like historically. So the way I'll answer this question is kind of like historic trends, and then I'll kind of get into what I'm seeing nowadays. This is my opinion also, but like historically, what I've seen is um, a lot of like romances. It's all there's a lot of love stories, which is kind of ironic because India is like a place where like arranged marriages are fairly common. So, but like the movies always romanticize this idea of true love and finding your love and going against your family. I would also say like, and this is very true of Shah Rukh Khan movies in the mid '90s to mid 2000s. There was like an explosion in what we call NRI content, non-resident Indian content.
Yeah.
So you had like Indian families or families from the subcontinent who were living in London, living in New York, and it was telling their stories, which was interesting to see, and it helped contribute to the popularity amongst the South Asian diaspora outside of the subcontinent. I will say now I am starting to see more experimentation, more indie art house filmmaking that's different from the traditional like romance, family drama
Yeah.
kind of norms.
And that's
And we're starting to see things like Made in Heaven, that Amazon Prime show that I showed you, Tom, like the
yeah,
the
that's a
one
great
about the
show by
wedding
the way.
planning business. Yeah. That talks about issues of homophobia, issues of misogyny, sexism, that kind of stuff. I just watched a movie yesterday called Padman, which talks about an entrepreneur in India who was fighting to create cheap, like, affordable pads for women in India because a lot of women weren't using them for their periods. So we're seeing a lot of more. I think we're seeing more social issue films, more issue-oriented films in Indian cinema, and that's changed from when I was a kid, where it was a lot more family romance focused. There was a lot more on that end. So that's what I would say in terms of my
Yeah,
observations. Tony.
I should give a bit more
Yeah,
context
I
too,
would.
because Nollywood films, my description of Nollywood films is probably like what they were like in the 90s, 80s. Nowadays too, there's a big
Mm-hmm.
movement of more films that are in English, so that they appeal to the diaspora and other people like outside of Nigeria too. And there's also like a lot of films about young urban Nigerians who are like rich and kind of and successful, and they're like,
Mm.
they're having like wedding parties in Dubai. I think there's actually a movie called Wedding Party that's super popular. So it's like showing all these affluent, like a different narrative, not just like people from the village who are like going to the city for the first time. It's now like the narrative of young, successful urban people who are having like destination weddings. And so those kind of movies that like appeal to the diaspora and a larger group is definitely the trend I'm seeing now in Nollywood too. Tony, you were gonna say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think whether it's Nollywood or Hollywood or Bollywood, there's going to be some universal themes that are in all these films. I think, uh, especially the films that kind of make it over here because they're only the biggest hits. At least when I was growing up. So, um, like like for popular culture, they're built for that consumer. So I'm really interested in getting back into Bollywood and seeing the more like indie Bollywood films that are maybe like addressing a very specific theme, rather than these broader themes like a forbidden love or a coming of age tale, like the things again
Mm.
that are I think expressed in all of these woods. I also like on the NRI content encore. Like I remember, like I don't even necessarily think uh, one one of these film industries needs to cater to their specific demographic in the sense that like one of the first films I remember like leaving an impression, weirdly enough, was Bend It Like Beckham because
Oh
it
yeah.
had
I
this
watched that
like
too. That's an amazing film.
yeah, and it
Very
had
British,
this
very British
Indian
focused.
star. Yeah, and it was one of the first times I remember seeing like an Indian in a white majority country in a film,
Mm.
Mm.
and I didn't relate at all to the plot,
You need to
but
watch
I
some proper
related to
football,
to
man.
the yeah to the demographics. So then I don't think that was a Bollywood film. So
No.
I
clearly, I
don't
think
think
there's
so
some
But
either.
Tony,
work to
that
do.
that that almost made it more powerful though, in the sense that like for like I know what you mean. Like seeing South Asian, so you're going to see South Asian representation in Bollywood because it's a South Asian industry, but seeing South Asian representation in perhaps like North American media, that is like, oh shit, not like that's different. You know what I mean? That's why it was cool to see a role like that. You're right.
So we touched base with Professor Nam to give us a perspective on what kind of stories are being told in Korean cinema and where writers and directors in Korean cinema get their influence from.
Traditionally, South Korean cinema it's had a strong tradition of what we call social realism, which
Right.
means dealing with realities of Korea. It has been a strong tradition since the 1960s, and we can see also that. So the mainstay in Korean cinema, even commercial blockbuster films, is concerned with social issues. Do you agree? So there is a concern about larger issues, how social problems affect people's everyday lives. So there is a
Mm.
concern for these social issues in Korean cinema, what we call critical realism and social realism in history of Korean films. And you can see Parasite, right? Parasite is all
Yeah.
about the issue of class, especially class polarization that's intensifying under this what we call global neoliberal capitalism. So not only Bong Joon-ho, but many of the Korean filmmakers are aware and consciously um, wanting to kind of deal with these issues in their films.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, Nam, I was wondering what else. So, I understand the critical review that some films take on like Korean society around class and issues like that. What other topics do you usually find movies addressed in Korean cinema addresses?
I think a lot of Korean films, especially independent films, deal with like a larger sense of violence. So the violence in school or the how the generation and harsh competition. So
Mm-hmm.
there is a lot of films that deal with the growing up, what it takes, or how the social issues or social environment uh, affect the what doing it growing up
Right.
films. Yes, like teen.
It, would you say Korea is like a fairly competitive society with regards to, like, for example, like everyone is trying to get the best grade or everyone's trying to get the best thing, or is it more egalitarian?
Very, very competitive.
Very competitive. Okay.
So, for example, and the suicide rate is very high also.
Oh,
So, among the advanced nations, it's number one. And if you have seen Snowpiercer, right? And
I think
Yeah.
Tony's seen it. Yeah.
yes, there was an article talking about younger generation. They're talking about Korea as the world of Snowpiercer for them. So there is, very competitive, high unemployment rate, difficult to get into good universities, etc., etc. And there is a lot of what do you say, social pressure. So all these conditions makes the life in Korea very competitive, and it is reflected in many of the films that deal with high school, the life of in high school. So one film is called Pluto. You have to, it kind of deals with a society where we have to win whatever the cost, regardless of others. So it's becoming kind of more morally um, moral confusion and moral decline. So a lot of films have a darker tone these days. So you can see in it, for example, let's talk about Bong Joon-ho films because
Yeah.
they are well known, that he doesn't offer, his films do not offer the happy ending, happy resolution, right? It is also, it's a story of failure or half success. So
Mm-hmm.
it has to do with the idea that Bong Joon-ho is about uh, telling very specific Korean stories, and that's the reason why his films inevitably subverts Hollywood genre conventions, because Hollywood genres are based on happy ending, and to me, it is a story of the mainstream Hollywood is about individual success, and everything will, you can solve anything if you try hard, right? At the end of the day, don't worry, everything is okay. right? This
Mm-hmm.
is kind of a convention of a Hollywood genre films in most cases. But if you want to tell a Korean story where people do not trust the system or authorities, so I think Hollywood films in a way reflect kind of general trust in the system or political or economic, whether in the system and authorities. But
And like the American dream too.
yes,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
because
yeah.
of the historical experience, Koreans lack that trust. They distrust
Mm,
authorities, they distrust
Mm.
government in a way, and a lot of things do not get solved in reality. So, if you do not want to sugarcoat the story, if you want to tell the story as Koreans experience it, the Hollywood convention do not work. So,
right.
So now, would you say that films like Snowpiercer and Parasite seem
mhm,
to be gaining popularity in countries like America now because that experience with, as you described it, global neoliberal capitalism seems to
mhm.
resonate with so many people right now?
Yes, of course. I think one of the reasons that Bong Joon-ho films really resonate with global audience is because we share the consequences of the global capitalism, class polarization, unemployment, moral corruption, political corruption. It's all about money, corporate greed, etc., right? It's
Mm-hmm.
um, and South Korea actually is at the forefront of what we call neoliberal capitalism. South Korea had a financial crisis in 2008,
Mm,
and International Monetary Fund bailed out so that South Korea doesn't go default.
right.
But on the condition that South Korea adopt more neoliberal policies like deregulation, softening of labor market, and the privatization of public welfare system, etc., etc. So Korea was really experiencing the dire consequences of these policies at the forefront. So, a lot of Korean filmmakers say, people ask them, how do you make those good films? And they say, come and live in Korea for a while. There are so many
Uh,
stories they can tell, right? So,
yeah,
yeah.
they're a reflection of some of the changes in Korean society as neoliberalism takes place.
Yes.
What was I saying? So yeah, there was this film that was released. I think it was called District 5 or District 9. And
Just
basically it was a film that portrayed Nigeria in a way that wasn't great, and it was a Hollywood film. I think like it was just a bunch of like mercenaries came to Nigeria, and like Nigeria was this kind of like gangster area, something along those lines. Anyway, the government banned the film because they hated the representation of Nigerians that much. I'm just wondering if you guys had seen similar reactions from the Indian government when a film portrayed the South Asian community.
Hmm.
sorry, are you talking about District 12?
Maybe I think that's it, right? Yeah, because it was definitely banned. I think so.
What was this the movie with like the aliens that land in Johannesburg?
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was such an interesting. It's funny because I my understanding was that the movie was supposed to be a metaphor for how African governments were responding to the refugee crises. Um, and it's interesting to hear like that perspective on it. Yeah, I'm not sure about Indian controversies in terms of films. I know there have been controversies in terms of like actors speaking out uh and like their political views. Like I feel like Bollywood actors actually do have a lot of sway with the public. Um and some of them have said problematic things, some of them have said good things, and the Indian government has kind of responded accordingly. Same with the public. Um yeah, I can't think of like much censorship, though
Um,
I might be wrong.
there definitely is.
Mm.
I know a couple examples. So one example I'll give is Chris Hemsworth recently shot a film called Extraction, and it was released on Netflix. And the movie was shot in Bangladesh, and it portrayed Bangladesh. And a lot of my friends who are Bengali, as well as different news articles that have or that have spoken about that film, have talked about all the things that it gets wrong and how it kind of depicts Bangladesh in a negative light. um, I would also say that there's been certain like historical dramas, like a movie like Padmavat, for example, which was released a couple years ago. It was a historical drama with where people were talking about like there was a lot of religious groups that were angry about it because it featured both Hindu and Muslim characters, and perhaps Muslims were angry with the way Muslims were characterized, or Hindus were angry with the way Hindus were characterized. So I would say any movie that seems to have touched on religious lines has often drawn a lot of strife in the subcontinent and surrounding countries, just because of it perhaps angering people of a specific religion. So that's what I've noticed in terms of controversies arising, either a depiction by the West or a depiction of a religion that people don't like.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't.
and again, like I feel like that's almost not unique to any one uh, country or film industry.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
there has been a long history of trying to ban films for moral reasons in the West
Hmm.
too, right? Like,
Hmm.
I know when Quentin Tarantino started releasing his films, which are widely regarded as genius now. A lot of theaters wouldn't play them. A lot of suburban moms got on TV and said, "Shut this guy down."
Hmm.
And I think that's true in every place.
Hmm. Hmm. No, that's a good point, Tony. It's not necessarily just relegated to the Bollywood or the South Asian countries. It's happening in other films and societies as well.
Um, so I guess the point you brought up, Tony, about representation is pretty interesting because recently, actually, I think last year or maybe a couple years ago, Genevieve Nanji, she's a Nigerian actress slash director, and she made a film called Lionheart, and it was hugely successful. It got massive ratings, got like 100% on Rotten Tomatoes,
Right.
um, and it was actually nominated, or it was put forth to the Academy to be nominated as Nigeria's selection for the best foreign film, right? So people thought it could win an Oscar, that it was that good. But when it got to the Academy, they actually didn't allow the film to be nominated because they said, and I quote, the most of the film was in English, which doesn't meet our standards for a foreign film. Now that's really interesting, and a lot of people got pissed, and rightfully so, because you know Nigeria didn't choose to be colonized by England and have our national language as English, and so somebody made a film that is in English because it's the national language, and so it could have a broad reach, but then it wasn't counted as a foreign film because it had an English language in it, so it wasn't put into the Academy. So it caused a whole like kerfuffle. Um, but eventually the Academy never let the film actually be nominated. But then what happened is Genevieve is now part of the Academy's selection committee after all the backlash. So I guess why I bring this up is, do you think Nollywood and Bollywood are starting to have a greater influence in Hollywood and the kind of content they create and the kind of content that they see as successful right now?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think so. Like to a certain extent, there's going to be some influence. I do think there are unique aspects to each film industry that I don't think have made it over as much, or aren't as related. So, like the musical components of a lot of Bollywood films, I think aren't as expressed in a lot of Hollywood films, for instance. Like it's a much bigger part of Bollywood culture. So, um, yeah, but I think that it's just kind of inevitable with globalization. My hope is that we see a lot of different films emerge about experiences being part of a diaspora or an immigrant experience or things like that. So yeah, I'm not quite sure, but
Actually, I wonder, is it more a case of Hollywood being influenced by foreign media so that they make Hollywood films more diverse? Or is it a case of Bollywood and Nollywood getting better as an industry on their own and having global appeal? Like which way do we see it going? Which way is better? I don't really know.
Yeah, well, I think the reason, Bollywood ends up producing films for broader South Asia, and Nollywood ends up producing films for other African countries, right, that are popular in other African countries, is because of economies of scale and access to capital to produce these artistic works. And I think as those countries continue to develop and have more access to those resources, there's going to be a wider spread appeal. Like I think that's why Hollywood has such a permanent fixture in many different countries. Like you can go to almost any country on earth and watch a Hollywood film. And I think it's because there's like a high production value. They're able to um, get their movie in all these different theaters. And I'm sure there's like a colonial component. Um, so I think all of those things are true.
So let's hear from Nam about the government's role in Korean cinema and how Korean cinema was influenced by foreign film industries like Hollywood.
Yes.
Sorry, Dr. Nam. I was just going to ask you. So, after the military dictatorship was over and we moved more into a democracy, I know the Korean government invested a lot in K-pop, for example, and its expansion around the world. Did they have a similar investment into Korean film and its expansion?
Good question.
I think when you talk about Korean wave, as Tom
Mm-hmm.
talked about, it's mostly about K drama and K
Hmm.
pop, and it is what constitutes the larger part of Korean wave, Hallyu they speak. But Korean cinema is mostly done by a private sector, I guess, although Korea has organization, Korean Film Council, government-run organization that promotes and supports filmmaking, film education, etc. But mostly done by private sector and by the efforts of the film industry people.
Mm.
So what really like brought the emergence of Korean cinema, the renaissance of Korean cinema in the 2000s, is the achievement of democracy and freedom of expression.
Hmm.
So the lot of the directors you get to know about Korean cinema, including Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, Lee Chang-dong, Hong Sang-soo, etc., etc., are the
Hmm.
new generation who were lucky to have a total freedom of creating films they want. So really want to emphasize how important freedom of expression is for creativity. So,
I
like
Mm.
Hollywood, Korean directors are now under one, I guess, the censorship limitation, which is money, right? It's a universal issue
universal
Right.
limitation.
for
Yeah.
filmmakers. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
how do you get your films funded? Other than that, they don't have any other limitation.
Yeah, I'm just really interested in that as well. Kind of the intersection between capital and the ability to express yourself, as you note. So, how do you think access to capital, either limited or is now perhaps contributing to Korean film, and do you see that impacting film in other countries as well?
I think it always also relates to the prior question that you
Hmm.
posed about the government role in filmmaking in Korea. I remember it's 1994 when Jurassic Park dominated the world, the Hollywood blockbuster, right? And we had a civil government. The name of the president was Kim Yong-sam, and he said famously that creating and selling a film like Jurassic Park is equivalent to selling 1.5 million Hyundai cars. So,
Wow.
from the government perspective, not the industrial perspective, from the government business perspective, films, there was an awareness that films can be an important export commodity. So there was a support to kind of build a strong film industry. And from that point, a lot of corporates like Samsung, Daewoo, which is doesn't exist anymore, but a lot of the corporate capitals began to invest in filmmaking in the late 1990s. So a lot of capital was invested in filmmaking. And at the same
Mm.
time, the emergence of Korean cinema also has to do with the resistance from the Korean film industry against Hollywood domination. Um,
Ooh.
I don't know if you know about the system called screen quarter.
No, I don't think we're
No,
familiar.
no.
Could you explain it
Screen
to our
quarter
listeners?
is a protection system where the every screen is must show their domestic film for a certain number of days in a year. Because otherwise, without that
Fascinating.
protection system, all the theaters would only wanted to show Hollywood films, which is most profitable, right?
Right.
Yes. But then in 19, so the film industry is also very much in relation to what's going on in a economic policy and system. But in late 1990s, with a trade agreement between South Korea and the US, the America demanded that South Korea eliminate the screen quarter system. Um, they were offering, if you eliminate the screen quarter system, we will buy you more cars, more electronics, etc., etc. So, but then it became a crisis for Korean film industry people because when you eliminate screen quarter system, Mexico did that 10 years ago before Korea, and the Mexican industry really kind of declined drastically. So South Korean film people knew about that
Mm.
example. So there was a fierce struggle against the elimination of the screen quarter system. But at the
Mm.
same time, they discussed how to compete with Hollywood blockbusters.
Mm,
So, one of the strategies the Korean filmmakers, producers, and directors and critics all together, they were kind of a new generation. They devised what the idea of Korean style blockbuster, which is well, the audience really like Hollywood film language, which is very effective in telling us stories. So
Mhm.
why don't we adopt or borrow Hollywood film language, but tell specifically Korean stories?
Mhm. Mhm. So a little bit of a pivot here. I just think this might be an interesting topic to explore. But when Parasite came out, I remember reading about how there was a bunch of Americans who were like angry and they're like, "Oh, how come it's not dubbed in English? I have to read subtitles. Like what the heck? Like it was like the worst problem in the world, right?" And to me, I found that to be really really like dumb, just because I grew up on, first of all, consuming Bollywood films that were, before I could understand Hindi. Now I can understand it pretty well, but before I couldn't, so I had to read the subtitles and do it that way. Then I started watching anime, and anime is in Japanese. If you're watching the Japanese dubs, then you read the English subtitles. And so I'm really used to that as an art form. And so I've even watched like French films, I've watched different language films, and I have no problem. I'm like, oh, this is cool because I'm used to reading the subtitles. Do you think that, like, for both of you, growing up with perhaps media in different languages made you more comfortable with, consuming subtitles, and made it something that was just easy for you to do and made you more comfortable to check out foreign films in different languages?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's kind of weird to me. Like, I remember Bong Joon-ho saying in response to that something like, "Once you overcome the 1 inch tall barrier of subtitles, you're going to be introduced to so many more amazing films, right?" And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's so true. And I think growing up, having experienced like a film with subtitles, it just seems incredibly normal. Whether it's, yeah, watching, anime, or uh, watching Bollywood or Nollywood, like, I think it just seems like such a trivial thing. Like, it's so easy to read subtitles to me. But I remember having a conversation with one of my white friends, and I recommended Parasite to him. I was like, you should go watch Parasite. And he was like, I would, but subtitles. And like, it's like that to me, like, that's actually stunning. Like, subtitles to me are such an easy thing to overcome. Like,
Word.
It's
it
just
just seems
reading.
so incredibly easy, but some people don't think so. So
Yeah,
Do you think these are the same people? Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
no, I find it funny. Like, definitely there's a point to it that, three of us grew up in households where we were watching films that were in like Hindi or in Yoruba or in Igbo, and they had subtitles in it because we couldn't fully understand it, and so maybe we're used to it. We're used to reading subtitles quickly. But I mean, in American schools, if I'm not mistaken, like, don't they learn French, Spanish, German? Isn't that a requirement that you also have to study a second language? And then aren't most people in America also probably from, immigrant backgrounds that speak maybe Polish at home, Ukrainian, or whatever? I don't think it's an excuse to say that, you're not used to just reading subtitles. I don't know. I find it baffling, and I think you said it best, Tony. Like that, it's a 1 inch barrier that I feel like people are just. I I wonder if if part of it is just ignorance too, like, or some sort of superiority complex that if it's not in English, I'm not going to watch it, or it can be good. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of frustrating to me. I don't have a great thought about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think just the aversion to another language or experiencing something in another language, I think inherently relies on some level of ethnocentrism. Like,
I
I
I
think
agree,
there's,
Tony, man. Because
yeah,
sorry, Tony.
there's
Like,
like a,
the
a
point of like
similar demo
people.
that also says, "Hey, when you're in our country, you speak our language," and
Exactly.
it's like this.
That's
It's the
exactly
same
what
Yeah.
I
thing.
was gonna say.
It's the same
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. Yeah, it's this idea again. Like, if it's in English, if it's not in English, it can be good, and that's just baffling, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I will say though? I don't think it's unique to just English speakers, right?
Mhm.
Because if I
Mhm.
go to India and I talk to some of the uncles out there, man, or some of the aunties, they're not gonna watch a Hollywood film. They're gonna be like, "What is this?"
Mhm.
Like, and I think there's less of that at the moment because Hollywood is so pervasive globally. But I can see that starting to develop a lot more. Like, I think it's just, um yeah, it's just
But
otherism. Like, people are uncomfortable seeing
Tony,
the
I wonder though. Like, I get it too that some people, like back home too, some people might not want to watch a film in English because they're like, "What is this?" Right? But I feel like there's a greater sense of appreciation that something in another language can still be good. Maybe because those societies are way more multicultural, right? So in Nigeria, we have like over English is the official language, but we have over 200 languages, right? India
mm,
has close to that same number. So maybe there is just a greater appreciation for like people who speak other languages. But then again, I think about
Yeah.
America, and you
yeah.
have like a large Spanish speaking population. Like,
That
And
shouldn't
we,
that
we
say
also
Yeah,
need to
like
acknowledge
in a place like, go ahead.
yeah, we also need to acknowledge that a remnant of colonialization is that English is spread all over the world, right? Like India is the largest speaking English country on the planet, so of course
Yeah.
they can easily access Hollywood films. Um,
Hmm.
but the other way around, and maybe this speaks to like a problem overall. Like I'm not sure if this is as pervasive in Europe, for instance, where they are multilingual. Um, like I don't know, but I think a lot of people in Canada and America, they only speak one language, and they're just used to it. Like they're used to kind of just experiencing English,
Hmm.
and I don't know. I think once you pop the kind of national bubble of entertainment that people
Mhm.
consume, you're open to like the remaining 7 billion people on the planet. Like and all of the artistic works they
Yeah,
create. So it is like again, like I think Bong Joon-ho stated it so well. It's this 1 inch barrier, and that's all you have to do. You just have to walk over the 1 inch barrier, and there's this whole amazing new world of entertainment that you can watch.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
as good.
100%.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And yeah, it couldn't have said it.
yeah. Um, yeah. One thing I will say, with regards to this topic is that, so two things. One, I think that Tom, and you can let me know how this is in Nollywood, but with regards to a place like India, because India has so many different languages, there's also like different film industries that have kind of popped up there. Perhaps not as big as Bollywood and Hindi cinema's pervasive grasp, but like I know Punjabi. There's a burgeoning Punjabi cinema scene. There's a burgeoning scene in South Indian languages like Tamil and Kannada. There's definitely like these different films that aren't in Hindi that are blowing up in popularity and or get adopted in Hindi as well. And so that's something that I don't think Bollywood has because it's just English. Sorry, Hollywood has because it's just English, right?
Yeah,
And so
I
Yeah,
I,
and
I think
same,
that is a
we need
distinction.
same thing happens in Nollywood too. Like we have Yoruba films, Igbo films, Hausa films. We have films that are in like broken English as well to kind of cross the divide, I guess.
Gotcha.
It's a good point. It's a good point.
we do need to acknowledge though there is a little bit of a racial component to this. Um, in terms of people, at least like maybe I'm just assuming this, but like there is this it's seeming perception that European films, well, European films are classy and avant-garde and like edgy and sophisticated. And I think those same people that are like, oh, I watched a French film and it was all French. Like a lot of them won't watch Bollywood and they won't watch Nollywood. So I think there is
Mm,
that aspect too.
mm, that's true.
So, what does Professor Nam think about subtitles and the barrier to watching foreign films for people in North America?
Do you see any kind of cultural barriers to the globalization of these blockbuster films? So, for instance, the reluctance of someone to watch a movie with subtitles, or cultural aversion to other cultures' films. Like, do you see that playing a role in the spreading of these films?
Yes, it does, I think. And Korean movies and Korean drama and K-pop has been tremendously popular in other regions like Asia, uh, East Asia, South Asia, and Middle East. But it has been very difficult with especially North American audiences. It's because I think the English speaking population, because it's a global language and they don't have to learn second language, right?
Why do you think that
So
is?
North American audiences are very monolingual.
Mm,
So they are not used to watching subtitled films, right? And but I was talking with one of my students about a few years back, and he was telling me that the younger generation is different because they have less resistance to subtitles because they grew up playing Japanese video games which had subtitles.
And
So I
watching
think,
anime too, probably.
yes,
And watching anime. You're talking to some anime fans here.
younger generations are changing, but I think there is still this kind of discomfort at watching
Yeah.
films with subtitles.
Do you think that, so I think for me, like I'm reflecting on how being a consumer of foreign films has changed my worldview. And one thing that I think it's definitely taught me is a deep respect for, and we've kind of touched on this already, but like a deep respect for other languages other than English. And especially like growing up with my dad or meeting other South Asian people who would often speak more than like three languages. It was like my dad, for example, speaks Nepali, Hindi, Punjabi, Orissa. Like he speaks all these languages, and it's just so common. And so when I think about like people here that often get lambasted for their broken English, but then I think I'm like, yo, these people know like 3 or 4 or 5 different languages, and y'all only know one. You know what I mean? So it's definitely given me. I don't know about you, but for me, it's definitely given me an appreciation for other languages and understanding that the world doesn't just revolve around English. Like there's other languages with things to say.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think those are lessons that are just that you can just learn from experiencing foreign films. Like I think
Right.
relating to the immigrant experience really makes you understand that like you're a bit of a global citizen. Like everyone is a human first, and then their nationality second, kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of people don't see that. Like they think there are these huge gulfs in like fundamental human experiences depending on the country you live in, and certainly the social context, economic context, all that stuff changes. But we're all human. Like we all are
Mhm.
interested in the same kind of art or ex- expressing ourselves differently. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I think yeah, I think there's definitely that aspect.
Yeah, and one thing I will say, like people, recently a lot of people in North America, maybe not recently, but people have got this whole idea of, travel the world to, find yourself or learn something new or whatever. Um, Along those lines, though, if you really want to immerse yourself in a new culture, like start with their films. Like they tell
Yeah.
stories that are different. They tell stories from a different perspective, and I think the language might be a bit of a barrier, that 1 inch barrier, but the language also causes them to approach the film in a very different way that you just don't see in Hollywood, and that makes it just way more interesting, different, and it's a great way to get your feet wet before you actually decide to like travel to a country.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. We do need to acknowledge though, like we're all people that really are interested in media entertainment and want some high quality media entertainment. And I think a lot of people in our generation are. There's a lot of people that again like they just want to watch their one Fast and Furious movie that year. You know,
Check it off.
and if you pitch them, you're like, hey, add a second movie this year. You can also watch Doom. You know, like I think those people are gonna be like, what? You know, I haven't even watched 1917. I haven't watched all these English films. Like why would I do that? Um,
Yeah.
so I think there is just kind of like a priority issue too.
When I guess I wonder when you guys because three of us are fairly immigrated now, or what's the word? Well, yeah, we're fairly embedded in North American culture. I wonder, like, when you guys have
Right.
kids, would you make sure they watch Nollywood and Bollywood stuff like that? Keep them in the loop.
I think I will. Uh, I think mostly for the representation. Um, like being able to see someone that looks like you interact with other people that look like you, and I think it's impossible. Like if I have kids, like I'm gonna assume that some of the cultural experiences I've had are going to be expressed in their lives, right? So being
Mm-hmm.
able to get in touch with that and appreciate that part of your culture, I think it's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's about kind of sharing cultural experiences that are valuable to me. And so for me, like for my Nepalese heritage, that would likely be my language, my food, my family, that kind of thing. And in terms of my interest as a child, it would likely be one of them was Bollywood, and so I would likely pass that on as well.
Yeah, I agree. Now I want to change gears just a little bit because we have just looking at the time as well. So I wanted to ask a different kind of question. So, like you said, you've been living in America now for about 20 years. So you're part of what I would say like is like the Korean diaspora, right?
Yes.
Um, I wonder for the Korean diaspora, how often do they still engage with Korean cinema? And is there what are kind of the attitudes around playing Korean films while you're away in the diaspora, and maybe if you have kids in in the diaspora, do you make sure you raise them on Korean films? Kind of, could you just comment on that as well?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Lot of Korean friends I know in the US, they are hooked into Korean drama and Korean movies, and I think it has to do with I when I first came to the US, I was very excited to live in the US, have a new life, new way of life, etc., etc. But after about 3 or 4 years, I began to miss the language,
Mm,
the living language. It's not
Mm.
from the book, but the K drama offered me the world that you don't have to explain anything, the culture you don't have to explain, and they speak the Korean language. So a lot of the diasporic communities do engage with K drama and K movies. And in where I live in California, we have two theaters in Los Angeles, in Orange County, established by a Korean theater chain where they show Korean films. So yeah, in that sense, people living in California have more access to Korean films. Yes, of course, but the second generation, so to speak, I think
mhm,
they're becoming they are becoming interested in Korean culture now, just the same as Asian American community or non-Asian community like. So it's becoming more and more popular, I see, especially K-drama. I
yeah.
come across a lot of non-Korean people when I introduce myself as a Korean. The first thing they say, "Oh, I watch K-drama every day," but not so much yet about Korean movies.
So we didn't want to end the conversation without giving all of our listeners some of the boys and I's recommendations on films to watch or start watching from Bollywood and Nollywood. And we also asked Dr. Nam for her recommendations on films, Korean films for our listeners to start watching as well. So we hope you enjoy them.
Okay, I'll suggest my film. I think I know what Ankur's getting at. There's this film called Zindagi Na Miliki Dobara. I would really recommend it. I really enjoy the movie. It's really cool. Uh, it's basically these three Indian guys that knew each other in college, and they reunite in Spain to do like a road trip before one of them gets married. And it's just like a really
Yeah,
cool
you've
film.
told me to watch this and I haven't watched it yet. See.
It's really good, man.
Yo, it's really good. It's really good. It's on Netflix.
Okay, so for Nollywood film, I think the one I mentioned earlier is a pretty good one for people to start their Nollywood journey. So it's called Wedding Party, and it's bright, it's colorful. I think it's a destination wedding to Dubai, if I'm not mistaken. And Nigerian weddings, much like Bollywood, not much like Indian weddings, are bright, colorful, dramatic. So I think that's a good one for people to get access to. I'm not sure if it's on Netflix anymore. It used to be, but you can find it. It's called Wedding Party.
Okay, so I'm gonna suggest two. I'm gonna break the rules. Haha, sucks. So I'm gonna suggest one that's kind of like more old school, traditional, like Bollywood, and another one that's a little bit more new school, modern, like more socially focused. So the old school movie, it's a Bollywood movie that every South Asian Desi family has seen at some point in their lives. Kabhi Kushi Kabhi Gum. It is a melodramatic, just roller coaster of emotions about a boy in a rich family who decides to marry a girl who's not the one that their family wanted them to marry and is shunned away from that family, and then another family member's attempts to rejoin this family together. So it's a beautiful film. It's kind of cheesy. It's very dramatic. It's very over the top, but it's entertaining. It makes you feel good. So that's what I'd say is one of them. The other one is distinctly different, and it's called Made in Heaven, and it is
Okay, that's not
it's a
a
TV
film.
show
That's a cheat code.
about it's a TV show about a wedding planning business in India, and the TV show is, I think it was just released last year. It's by the same. Oh, it's raining here. I'm sorry if you guys hear some rain, but it's by the same director that made Zindagi Na Milege Dobara, Zoya Akhtar. And the thing with this film, the thing with this TV show is like it touches on like the wild nature of Indian weddings, the behind the scenes drama, but it also touches on like social issues like, you know, misogyny. It touches on like family expectations. It touches on homophobia in India. It's actually a really, really interesting, engaging watch. And so I think both of those two films are really good. Both of those two pieces of media are very good, just in very different ways.
Films that are people that are completely new to Korean cinema, or
Yeah, I would say completely new, or maybe they've seen
Yeah,
Parasite, but that's about it.
wow. Okay. I would recommend them to watch other Bong Joon-ho films and Park Chan-wook films. And it depends on the, I think the American audience tend to like genre-based films, right? So maybe Kim Ji-woon's Good, the Bad, and the Weird, Kimchi Western, or a Korean take on the Western movie, Park Chan-wook's Handmaiden, Old Boy, and Lee Chang-dong's The Secret Sunshine. In classical film, 1960s classical film of Stray Bullet. That's the kind of classic example of Korean critical realism. And Kim Gi-young's The Housemaid, 1960. Although it's a very stylish and expressionist film, but it also is based on Korean realities. So, yeah. And of course, women filmmakers. There's it's still Korean film industry is still very male dominated. In commercial mainstream sector, the presence of women directors are very minimal, like less than 10%. But in independent film sector, the presence of women filmmakers are really, really strong. I would really recommend you see Yoon Ga-eun's The World of Us or The House of Us, and also one that made really garnered lots of awards, Kim Bora's Hummingbird, and other. Oh, I can give you an endless list of films.
Sonam, I know you're about to release a book. Could you tell our listeners what the book's about and what inspired you to write it?
I actually wrote a book on Bong Joon-ho's films. It's coming out in September from Rutgers University Press. The title is The Films of Bong Joon-ho. What I wanted to do in the book is to contextualize his films, specifically within the cultural, historical, political context from which Bong Joon-ho, filmmakers like Bong Joon-ho and his films emerged. So the idea is that films are the product of its time, and there are other cultural and historical conditions which enabled those films. And I think because Bong Joon-ho wanted to make films that are telling specifically Korean stories, there are a lot of references or iconic images or cultural or historical subtext that non-Korean audiences may not be aware. So I wanted to provide those contexts so that the readers or audiences can have a more full understanding of his approach to filmmaking. And he is a rare director who seamlessly combines entertainment film with social commentary. So he's very political in the sense, and how his filmmaking was possible within the Korean film industry and the
Awesome.
global context as well.
That's it from us, everybody. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Special thanks goes out to Professor Nam Lee for coming on our podcast and giving us the history and lessons from the Korean film industry. We're going to release actually our full interview in a bonus episode of our podcast, so look out for that, a full interview with Dr. Nam Lee. We specifically also spoke about feminism in media and the history of Korean film, so look out for that for sure. If you really like today's episode, or if you have any suggestions or questions for us, please, we can always be reached at thecuspod@gmail.com, or if you prefer, you can slide into our DMs on Instagram. It's at thecuspod as well. Thank you, everyone, and see you next time.